Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. Today we are looking at gameplay changes made in our remake of an old project called Squirts. Now this is actually part 3 of a series focusing on different aspects of our remake. So if you'd like to get caught up, a link to the playlist for this series can be found in the description. And as always, before we get into these crazy changes, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed today's video, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Now we've got a lot to talk about in terms of gameplay changes. The first major change is the upgrades feature was not carried over, mostly due to time constraints, but also because it felt very surface level in terms of progression. And because Squirts was inspired by a Warframe minigame, the mechanics reflected as much. So the player would have to not only collect water, but then pump their guns to use it effectively. And admittedly, maybe it's just my older age, but that system felt a little tedious to engage in. It basically required the player to keep track of 2 different values in order to play normally, which kind of felt like it took away from the action itself. So the system was streamlined and the pumping was removed. But to keep things interesting, water spouts would now give random amounts of water per tick, which would result in sometimes getting a full refill or just a few drops. Another change was to the weapons. Now the original upgrade system felt like it made weapon types a little redundant. So since we couldn't focus on upgrades due to time, weapon types were made the main priority. And just to keep things simple, we went with the basics. Your average pistol style single shot, the SMG with high fire rate, a shotgun with bullet spread, and the one weird weapon, a short but wide wall of water bursting from the player's nozzle. There's also this behemoth, which was probably my favorite, not only because its size makes it hard to miss, but because when popped will burst into smaller projectiles. And as expected, all the projectiles behaved accordingly, with shotgun blast slowing down over time, and the spray wall being a literal hurt box instead of a projectile. Now, while on the subject of new additions, the player has been given the ability to dodge roll. Now, it works similarly to Fish from Nuclear Throne if you've played that game, in that the dodge can somewhat be controlled and will provide the player with a very tiny window of invulnerability. There's also a short cooldown before the player can dodge again, and the dodge can be cancelled at any time by releasing the dodge button. Alternatively, the dodge only lasts for about a half second. Now, one major improvement in the remake was the focus on generation and spawning. Like in the original, world generation was done using a temporary DS grid and disks to create random land masses. Each land tile is then recorded to an array, with edges of said land being recorded to a different array. These 2 arrays would then be used to spawn trees, rocks, and enemies accordingly. Now in the original, enemy spawns were done pretty poorly. It would choose a random water tile and then try to find a nearby land tile to spawn to. But in the remake, this process is reversed, with an edge tile being chosen and a nearby water tile being used as a cosmetic spawn point. Now, there was meant to be an animation with particles showing this move from water to land, but I just didn't have time to implement it. And so this next bit I was going to lump into the graphics, but I think it's much more of a technical thing than a graphical thing. Now, as mentioned in part 2, we were able to achieve the original's look and feel using far fewer resources. One major downside is that in the world of Squirts, not everything interactable is outlined. For example, projectiles are not outlined, and neither are the trees or rocks, which, mind you, are solid objects with collision properties. Now, if we want to respect depth, like for example players appearing behind tall trees as opposed to in front of them, well, we'd need to draw everything, including the trees, at the same time. This means those trees and rocks would also be outlined, which isn't the worst idea, but really goes against the original's aesthetic. So a hack of sorts was required. 2 layers would be added to the room, one above and one below the layer where the characters will be drawn. Then trees and rocks, aka props, would be spawned into the world like normal. However, instead of drawing said props then and there, they were broken down into 2 parts. The bottom portion, which almost always will be blocked via collision, was drawn to the lower layer, and the top portion, which would most likely appear above characters, again due to collision, were drawn on top. The effect wasn't perfect, but with enough time it could be. Now, I'm gonna save my opinions for all of these changes for next episode, but in the meantime, I would love to know what you thought of all these changes and approaches, especially if you were here for the original Squirts videos. And of course, if you would like to play a few other games previously featured on the channel, or want early access to the weekly game dev videos, subscribe to my Patreon. With that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.